Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gaming Intercom video. Let us discuss a recent snippet of an interview with Crytek. And in it they've mentioned that the 8GB of memory available for both next generation consoles, the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, will likely be very limiting in the future. Sean Tracy, who acts as Crytek's US Engine business developer manager, said, and I quote, "I would have to agree with the viewpoint that 8 gigs can easily be filled up, but also keep in mind that developers don't necessarily even have access to all 8 gigs. For example, the Xbox One retains some RAM for OS purposes. Since technology, as Ray Kurweil states, progresses exponentially, we will soon find that computational requirements of games will quickly hit the ceiling of a few gigs of RAM. We already had to manage quite intensely our memory usage throughout Ryse, and this will be one of the limiting factors surely in this next generation. As hardware gets stronger, the complexity of scenes can be increased and dynamism within them. However, with that said, it's not raw power alone that allows for photorealistic graphics, but technology that intelligently scales and utilizes the hardware has to offer." So, there are a couple of developers who've spoken out about this previously, including the ones behind the Havoc technology, and a couple of others who as well have been doing a lot of middleware engine work. I think we should just tackle one part regarding the Xbox One. It's also important to remember that the PlayStation 4 has the same issue. Now, the exact memory reserves for both haven't been completely and utterly addressed. In other words, we don't know to the megabyte, but we have a rough guesstimate, which is kind of an educated guess. Both are basically giving away the same amount of memory. Both have a reserve of about 3 gigabytes, although it's allocated slightly different, with the PS4s using a kind of virtual memory system, as well as a system managed slice of memory that's 512 megabytes. If you want more information on that, you can do a search on the channel for PS4 memory and it will pop right up. Honestly speaking, however, I do feel that it's going to be very much a case of smart resource management. And you can kind of tell this with the next generation engines. The CryEngine, for example, next generation Unreal Engine, all of these different engines are really pushing towards a more fine-tuned and managed solution. And definitely memory, particularly with like larger assets, is going to get used up real fast. I do think we're a slightly better situation than the previous generation of systems, particularly when you start looking at titles like, let's say, Oblivion, which was not exactly early in the Xbox 360's life, but it was fairly recent, and you could definitely see that the system was kind of struggling, and memory was definitely a bane for the system. It only had 512 megabytes of RAM, same as the PS3 total, but of course, once you start to factor in system allocated amounts of memory, it becomes even more of a burden. A lot of the time as well now, with these current games, a lot of them are still based on 32-bit code, and there are quite a few which barely address more than 4 gigs of memory, particularly the cross-platform ones. This has started to become less of the case, but particularly with PCs, I mean, most games now really do start taking up a lot of memory. Now, there are definitely ways around it. For example, you can start masking loading, or you can do a lot of texture streaming and that type of thing, which can be definitely a good way to get around memory limitations. And even back in the day of like the PlayStation 1, for example, where of course CDs were becoming fairly prolific, there were clever loading screens all the time. Or one of the most obvious and infamous ones was like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, where you'd go from like one area to the next, and you go through that hall, and all it was basically is a glorified loading screen. And there were certainly many other instances of pretty much the same type of scenario. So memory limitations of the consoles are definitely going to be a thing. However, here's what you'll have to kind of notice. Everyone has a opinion on what's going to be the limiting factor. For example, if we were to take a look at the guys behind The Last of Us, in other words, Naughty Dog, and were to look at their postmortems and their thoughts and opinions of the technology, they did mention a couple of times that one of the big problems was the CPU. Others have mentioned, well, memory can be a little bit of a limiting factor, so you have to be a bit careful, and so on. Others are pointing out, of course, it's the GPU. So it really, like, you know, what's the limiting factor? Most likely, to be honest, the systems are going to be fairly balanced. If I had to take an educated guesstimate, I think the CPU is probably going to be the biggest issue with the current next generation systems. Do remember that despite the fact that 5 gigs is available, roughly, there is quite a lot of wiggle room, in theory, between both systems anyway. But obviously it depends on what both Sony and Microsoft do with their system allocation. Anyway, I thought I'd just cover this and let you guys know of it. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.